My name is Nora Vance. I'm 34 years old. On Thanksgiving Day, November 27, 2025, at 4:52 in the afternoon, my father stood up at the head of a table in a house I had been paying the taxes on for 6 years, lifted a glass of cheap sparkling wine, and said, to Grant, who made something of himself. And to Nora, proof that we tried. 14 people laughed. Not all of them meant it. But they laughed. My mother didn't laugh. My mother waited until the noise thinned out, then leaned toward my cousin Tessa like she was sharing a recipe and said, loud enough to carry, failure isn't something that happens to you, honey. It's something you are. Nora's been one since she was 19. We've just learned to set a plate for it. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't set down my fork or push back my chair or make a single sound. I reached for the water pitcher, filled my mother's glass to the top because she'd been talking with a dry mouth for 20 minutes, and I set it back down on the coaster. Then I looked at the clock on the microwave through the kitchen doorway. 4:53. What they didn't know was that at 5:07 p.m., a woman named Margaret Ferreira was going to ring the doorbell of 818 Cherry Bend Road holding a single sealed envelope, and that in the 15 minutes after that, my parents were going to find out that they did not own the chair my father was standing behind. They had no idea that my grandmother had been dead for 20 months and was still, quietly, the smartest person in the room. Before I tell you how I took apart everything they thought they'd built, and I mean everything, down to the mailbox, do me one favor. Hit subscribe right now. Not later. Right now. Because by the end of this story you're going to want to know what happened to my mother after the dust settled, and I promise you, I'll tell you in the next one. And drop your city and your local time in the comments. I read every single one. I want to know exactly where in the world you're sitting when you hear this. To understand the toast, you have to understand the table. Not the dining room table. The other one. The folding card table with the fake wood grain top and the leg that never locked right, the one that lived in the hall closet under the coats. In our family, that table came out for holidays, and it always came out for me. I was 6 the first time. Grant was 9 and had a friend over, and there weren't enough chairs, so my mother set the card table up in the hallway just outside the dining room, angled so I could see the corner of the tablecloth but nobody's face. She put a plate on it and a paper napkin and said, "You're the flexible one." I remember being proud of that. Flexible sounded like a compliment. Like being good at gymnastics. I sat at that table for holidays until I was 19. Not because there weren't chairs. There were always chairs after that first year. It became the arrangement. Grant's friends got chairs. Grant's girlfriends got chairs. Once, a man from my father's insurance office who nobody actually liked got a chair, and I ate Easter ham in the hallway at 22 years old with my knees turned sideways because the leg wouldn't lock. My parents are Richard and Diane Vance. My father sold commercial insurance in Traverse City, Michigan, for 31 years and was very good at explaining risk to other people. My mother taught 8th grade English for 9 years, quit, and spent the next 3 decades running committees, the Church Flower Fund, the Historical Society, the Cherry Blossom Parade route. She had a voice that could reach the back of a room without ever getting louder, and she used it mostly to describe her children to other people. Grant was the investment. I was the expense. She said that out loud once, in 2013, at a kitchen table in front of my aunt. Some children are investments and some are expenses. You budget differently. Grant became an orthodontist. 3 chairs, a practice on Garfield with his name on the glass, a lake house he couldn't afford, a wife named Kimberly, 35, who sold real estate and hated all of us with real professionalism. I was supposed to be a doctor. That was the plan they had for me, and it was a plan, not a hope, the difference matters. I was pre-med at Michigan State. Then on April 15, 2011, my grandmother Ruth had her first stroke, and there was nobody to sit with her, because my mother had the parade route and my father had renewals and Grant had boards. So I withdrew. I told myself it was for a semester. I moved into her back bedroom on Cherry Bend Road and I learned how to transfer a 108-pound woman from a bed to a wheelchair without hurting either of us. I learned what a sacral wound looks like on day 1 versus day 4. I learned the exact angle to hold a straw so a person with a weak left side doesn't choke. My mother called that throwing it all away. Ruth Adele Kessler was 76 that year. She'd run a hardware store on Union Street with my grandfather until he died in 1994, and then she ran it alone for 11 more years, and she talked like someone who had spent her life around inventory. Short sentences. Nothing wasted. The first week I lived there, she watched me try to fold a fitted sheet and said, "Stop apologizing with your hands." I said, "What?" She said, "You move like you're sorry you're in the room. Cut it out. You live here. I want you to understand something about her house." It smelled like coffee grounds and WD-40 and the lemon oil she put on the banister every Sunday. There was a brass key to the back door that hung on a nail by the light switch, and the nail was crooked, and she never fixed it because my grandfather had hammered it in. She kept a chipped blue enamel roasting pan that she refused to replace. Every October she'd say, "That pan's older than your father and twice as useful." She was the only person in my life who ever asked me a question and then waited for the whole answer. For 6 years I drove her to appointments in a 2004 Buick with a bad belt. I did her taxes. I cut her hair. And in the evening she'd deal out gin rummy on the kitchen table, the real one, the heavy one, and she'd say things I didn't understand yet. Things like, "Paper outlasts people, Nora." Things like, "Your mother thinks this house is hers. Let her think it. Thinking isn't owning." I thought she was being bitter. She was being specific. Here's the memory I don't tell people. When I was 9, I had my tonsils out at Munson Medical Center. October 1, 2000. It was supposed to be same day, but I bled after, and they kept me overnight for observation. Grant had a hockey tournament in Gaylord. My mother came into the recovery bay, put her coat on, and said, "You're not going to remember this anyway." Then she left. Both of them left. I was 9 years old in a hospital gown with a throat that felt like broken glass, and a nurse named Josefina Ruiz. She was 22 then, brand new, and she's 47 now, and you'll hear her name again, sat in a plastic chair beside my bed for 4 hours of her own unpaid time and fed me crushed ice with a spoon because I couldn't stop shaking. At 6:32 the next morning my mother came back with a styrofoam cup of coffee and said, in front of Josefina, "Did she make a scene?" I was 9. I said no. I was so proud that I hadn't. If you grew up being the one who was never enough, too loud, too quiet, too much, not enough, never the one they came back for, type the word enough in the comments right now. I need to know how many of us are sitting in the same silence. And if this is hitting close to home, hit like. Not for the algorithm. For yourself. Because somebody needs to tell you what nobody told you back then, it was never your fault. My grandmother died at 3:41 in the morning on March 4, 2024, in the back bedroom, with my hand on her sternum, which is where she liked it because she said it felt like being anchored. I was 32. I had been her hands for 13 years. By then I'd built something. Not a career my parents could pronounce at parties, but something. In 2017 I bought a used wheelchair-accessible van for $18,400 with money I'd saved $500 at a time, and I started driving people to dialysis. Non-emergency medical transport. Old people, mostly. People whose kids lived in Denver and felt bad about it. By November 2025 the company was called Cherry Bend Mobility. 6 vans. 9 employees. We'd done $340,000 in revenue that year and I had $71,200 in the bank and I had never once been late on a payroll. My father called it driving sick people around. He said it at his retirement party in 2023. A man asked what I did, and my father said, "Nora drives sick people around. Some people are born to carry. She's a wheelbarrow, not a person." And he laughed, and the man laughed, and I went and refilled the ice. I want to be honest with you about why I never fought back. It wasn't strength. It was arithmetic. I had done the math on that family 100 times and every version came out the same. If I said one true sentence out loud, I would lose all of them at once, and I had already lost so much that I'd started treating loss like a budget I couldn't afford to draw from. So I paid instead. Literally. From 2019 to 2025, I paid the property taxes on 818 Cherry Bend Road. My parents moved in 6 weeks after my grandmother's first stroke, to help, which meant they took the master bedroom and I kept the back room and the bedpans. Nobody ever discussed the taxes. The bill came, I paid it, the way I did everything. $3,640 average. $21,840 total. I have every receipt because I have every receipt of everything, which is a thing you learn to do when you grow up being told you're remembering wrong. And in May of 2022, when Grant's practice missed 2 months of equipment payments and a supplier put a lien on his chairs, my parents came to me. Not to Grant's in-laws. Not to a bank. To the wheelbarrow. My mother sat in my kitchen and said, "This is a family emergency, and you don't have anyone depending on you, so." I gave them $86,000. Everything I had. And I did one thing that I did not tell them was unusual, because they'd never asked me a single question about how I ran a business. I had them sign a promissory note. 2 pages. Simple interest. A repayment schedule starting January 2024. My mother signed it in front of a notary at the credit union on South Airport Road on May 2, 2022, and while she was signing she said, "You would need a contract." That's the saddest thing about you. They never made a single payment. Not one. When I brought it up in 2024, my father said the word gift like he was correcting my grammar. Then came October. On October 14, 2025, my mother called me at 9:13 in the morning, which was strange, because she didn't call me. She said there was some cleanup paperwork on Grandma's estate. A quitclaim deed. She needed my signature so they could get the title straightened out and stop dealing with lawyers. She was so casual about it. She said, "Just sign it and drop it in the mail, we're all exhausted." Here's the thing about being the family scapegoat. You become an expert reader. You spend your whole childhood decoding tone because your safety depends on it. And there was something in my mother's voice on that call that I had heard exactly twice before, both times when she wanted something and was pretending she didn't. I said I'd look it over. She said, "There's nothing to look over." I hung up and I drove the quitclaim deed to an estate attorney named Margaret Ferreira, 59, licensed in Michigan since 1993, office on Front Street above a bakery. I'd never hired a lawyer in my life. The consultation was $250 and I remember thinking that was insane money to spend on a piece of paper my mother said was nothing. Margot read it for about 90 seconds. Then she set it down, took her glasses off, and asked me a question that changed my life. She said, "Ms. Vance, do you know what a certification of trust is?" I said no. She said, "Your grandmother's estate closed in July." I know, because I probated it. I sent notice to the address of record. I never heard back from you. She paused. Who has been getting your mail at 818 Cherry Bend? My mother had. On June 9, 2019, 5 years before she died, 4 years after her second stroke, in an office 2 blocks from where I was sitting, Ruth Adele Kessler had executed a revocable living trust. She had deeded the house at 818 Cherry Bend Road into it. She had named exactly 1 successor trustee and exactly 1 beneficiary. Not her daughter. Not her grandson with the practice on Garfield. She had also left $63,500 in a money market account, and she had left one more thing, a sealed letter, held in Margot's file, with instructions written in her own hand. Not to be opened privately. To be read aloud, at the first family gathering after the estate closed, and only if I chose to have it read at all. She'd written, on the outside of the envelope, for Nora to decide. She'll know when. My parents were not heirs. They were occupants. They had been living in my house for a year and a half, sending me the tax bills, and asking me to sign away the deed with a pen from the credit union. I sat in that office and I did not cry. I asked Margot 3 questions. What does a 30-day notice to quit look like in Grand Traverse County? What is the statute of limitations on a written promissory note in Michigan? And are you available on Thanksgiving? She said 6 years. She said yes. And then she said, you should know that once this starts, it doesn't stop. I said, it stopped for 23 years. I'd like to see it move. For 5 weeks I said nothing. I went to Sunday dinner on November 2nd and my mother told me I looked tired and asked if I'd thought about doing something about the gray. I said no. I ate. I did the dishes. I made copies. I pulled 6 years of tax receipts and put them in order. I got a certified copy of the recorded deed from the Register of Deeds for $11. I got the promissory note and the notary's journal entry. I called Aunt Bernadette, my mother's older sister, 66, retired school bus driver, 31 years, never once missed a route, and I asked her one question, Bernie, did Grandma ever talk to you about the house? She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, honey, she talked to me about you. On November 20th, I asked my mother if I could bring someone to Thanksgiving. She said, oh, is it a man? I said, it's a professional. She laughed and said, God, Nora, don't be weird about it. Everything I'm about to tell you next happened in exactly 11 minutes. From 5:07 to 5:18 on Thanksgiving evening. 11 minutes that undid 23 years of damage. If you're not subscribed yet, what are you waiting for? The aftermath of what happens next is its own story, and I'm only telling that one to the people who are here for the long run. And comment below, what would you have done if you were standing where I was standing? Would you have walked away, or would you have done what I did? I read every comment. Every single one. There were 14 of us in that dining room. My parents. Grant and Kimberly and their daughter Delphine, 11, who is the only member of that household with a functioning conscience. Aunt Bernie. Uncle Dale, 70, who'd had a knee replaced in August and told everyone about it. Cousin Tessa, 22, in her second year of nursing school at NMC. Hal Brenneman, 71, the neighbor from 812, widowed, who came every year because my grandmother had invited him in 2009 and nobody had ever uninvited him. 2 of Kimberly's cousins. And Josefina Ruiz, because I had invited her. Josefina, who was Grandma Ruth's hospice aide for the last 11 months. Josefina, who fed a 9-year-old crushed ice in 2000 and did not know until that night that I remembered. My mother had put out the good plates and the blue enamel roasting pan, because it was the only thing big enough for a 22-pound turkey, and every year she complained about it and every year she used it. And in the hallway, angled so I could see the corner of the tablecloth and nobody's face, was the folding card table. At 34 years old. Set for one. My mother took my coat, looked at the hallway, and said, you know where you sit. I said, I do. I sat down at it. That's the part people don't believe. I sat down at the card table and I ate a roll and I let it happen, because the timing was not mine yet. It was 4:31. At 4:44 my father started in on Grant's numbers. Third chair, new hygienist, up 11%. At 4:49 Kimberly mentioned the lake house. At 4:52 my father stood up with the sparkling wine and said, to Grant, who made something of himself. And to Nora, proof that we tried. At 4:53 my mother told Tessa that failure isn't something that happens to you, it's something you are. At 4:58 Uncle Dale said, Diane, come on, it's Thanksgiving, and my mother said, I'm being honest. Honesty is a form of love, Dale. She's 34 and she smells like other people's medication. At 5:02 Aunt Bernie set her fork down and did not pick it up again. At 5:07 the doorbell rang. My mother said, who on earth, and my father said, Nora's professional, and there was that laugh again, and I stood up from the folding table in the hallway and opened the front door, and Margaret Ferreira came in out of the cold in a grey wool coat with snow on the shoulders, holding a leather folio and one white envelope. I said, "Everyone, this is Margot Ferreira." She was my grandmother's attorney. The room went quiet in a way I'd never heard that room go quiet. Margot didn't perform. That's what made it unbearable for them. She's a woman who has read wills to crying families for 30 years and her voice never goes up. She stood at the end of the table, opposite my father, and she said, "I'll be about 10 minutes. Mr. and Mrs. Vance, you were both sent notice of the probate closing in July at this address. Since I never received a response, I'm going to summarize on the record, in front of witnesses, and then I have documents to serve." My father said, "This is a holiday." Margot said, "It is." She opened the envelope. She read the certification of trust for the Ruth Adele Kessler Revocable Living Trust, dated June 9, 2019. She read the legal description of the property at 818 Cherry Bend Road, Traverse City, Michigan, deeded into that trust on the same date and recorded at the Register of Deeds on June 12, 2019. She read the name of the successor trustee and sole beneficiary. Eleanor Nora Vance. My mother said, "That's not possible." Margot said, "It's recorded. $11 at the county. Anyone here can pull it Monday." My father sat down. Not dramatically. His legs just stopped participating. He put one hand flat on the tablecloth like a man checking whether the floor was still there. And my mother, I want you to hear this exactly, my mother turned to me and said, "You went behind my back." I said, "She wrote it in 2019. I found out in October. When you asked me to sign the deed." The word deed landed in that room like a dropped plate. Kimberly said, "Wait. Diane. What deed?" Nobody answered her. Then Margot took out the second document, and this is the one that took the air out of the house. The promissory note. May 2, 2022. $86,000. Signed by Richard J. Vance and Diane K. Vance. Notarized. 0 payments received. And a demand letter, dated November 24, giving them 14 days. Grant said, "That was a gift." Margot said, "It's a 2-page note with an amortization schedule and a notary journal entry. I brought copies. Would you like one?" And Aunt Bernie said, into the silence, "Grant, she gave you every dollar she had. You bought a boat in August." That was the first one. That was the first witness to turn, and once one turns, they all do, because everyone in a family like mine has been keeping a private ledger for years and waiting for permission to read it out loud. Uncle Dale said, "Diane, you told the whole church this house came to you." Hal Brenneman, 71, from 812 Cherry Bend, said, "Ruth told me in the spring of 2019. Right on the porch. She said, 'The girl gets the house, Hal, and don't you say a word until somebody official does.' I've been sitting on that for 6 years." Tessa, 22, said, "Aunt Diane, you just called her a failure. 9 minutes ago. I timed it because I couldn't believe it." And then Josefina Ruiz stood up. 47 years old, hospice aide, 11 months in that back bedroom. She said, "I need to say something." She looked at my mother, not at me. She said, "In 11 months, I signed a visitor log every day. You are in it 4 times. She is in it 319. I know because I kept it. I still have it. I kept it because I thought someday somebody would call this girl a failure, and I wanted to be ready." That's when my mother's face came off. I don't have a better way to say it. For 34 years I had known there was another face under the committee voice, and I had only ever seen it in flashes, in cars, in hallways. In that dining room, in front of 14 people and a lawyer, it came all the way off. She stood up. She said, "You think a dead woman's paperwork makes you somebody?" I said nothing. She said, "I carried you for 9 months and I have regretted every one of them. I never wanted you. I wanted a second boy and I got you, and I have been polite about it for 34 years. Her voice never got louder. That's the part one still here. It never got louder. Delphine, 11 years old, started crying at the far end of the table, and Kimberly took her out of the room. Stop. Stop right here for 1 second. If your heart is pounding right now, if you've been waiting for this moment since the first minute of this video, smash that like button. Not for me. For every single person who was ever told they were nothing and outlived it. And subscribe, because what happened to Diane after this, after the room cleared, after the driveway, after the phone calls started at 11 that night, is something I have never told anyone. Not until now. And comment one word, what would you have said to Diane if you were standing in that room? One word. I'm reading them all tonight. Here is what I said. I said, okay. That's it. That's the whole thing. 23 years and my closing argument was one word, because I finally understood something at 5:16 p.m. on Thanksgiving. She had just told the truth in front of witnesses, and I did not need to add a syllable to it. The room hurt her. The room would never unhear her. My father said my name once. Nora. Like a question. Like a man reaching for a railing. I said, you have 30 days. Margot has the notice. Grant tried to negotiate. Of course he did. He came around the table with his hands out, orthodontist hands, and he said, let's be reasonable. There's equity here. There's a family conversation to have. I said, you've had 37 years of family conversations. I sat in the hallway for all of them. He said, you can't just take a house. I said, I didn't take it. She gave it. You just never asked her a question you didn't already know the answer to. Margot served the 30-day notice to quit at 5:18. She had a second copy for my father and she set it beside the blue enamel roasting pan, and I watched a piece of paper sitting next to that pan and thought, that pan is older than my father and twice as useful, and I had to look at the wall for a second. My mother did not collapse. I know that's what the story wants. She put on her coat and she walked out the front door into 29-degree weather without her purse and stood at the end of the driveway in the dark for 11 or 12 minutes, and Aunt Bernie, her own sister, 66 years old, went out and stood with her, not to comfort her. I watched them through the window. Bernie talked and my mother looked at the street. When Bernie came back and she was shaking. She said, I asked her if she meant it. About never wanting you. I said, and? She said, she asked me if the neighbors heard. 6 weeks later, on January 9, 2026, my parents moved into a 2-bedroom rental in Kingsley, 13 miles south, for $1,375 a month, which my father is paying out of a retirement account he had planned to leave untouched. The $86,000 became a consent judgment on February 3. They're paying $610 a month for the rest of a very long time. Grant's practice on Garfield defaulted on the equipment lease in February and he sold the third chair. Kimberly filed in April. She sent me a 2-line email that said only, I should have said something in 2022. I'm sorry I didn't. I wrote back, thank you for taking Delphine out of the room. My mother resigned from the Church Flower Fund and the Historical Society Board in January. Nobody asked her to. That's the part that I think actually broke her, nobody asked. She just understood that 14 people had been in that dining room and that 11 of them talked to other people, and Traverse City has 49,000 residents and about 6 degrees of separation total. Josefina Ruiz works for me now. She's my scheduling coordinator, 48 this year, $61,000 and full benefits, and she still keeps a log of everything, which is why my company has never lost a client. Tessa graduates in December. I'm paying her last 2 semesters, $8,900, and she doesn't know I know she cried in her car about it. And in April, an envelope came. Addressed in 11-year-old handwriting. Inside was a drawing of a van with a wheelchair ramp and 6 little stick figures, and on the back, in pencil, Aunt Nora, my mom says you help people get to the doctor. That's a good job. Can I ride in a van sometime? She rode in a van in June. She sat up front and asked Mr. Delvecchio, 88, about the war, and he lied about all of it, beautifully. I live at 818 Cherry Bend Road now. The brass key still hangs on the crooked nail by the light switch, and the nail is still crooked, and I will die before I fix it. The front room is my office. 6 vans became 9. Here's what I've learned about doors. Everyone thinks the story is that the door finally opened. It isn't. The door was never locked. I had been standing outside a room my whole life, with my hand on the knob, believing that the pressure on the other side was a lock, when it was just people. Just people leaning. And people get tired. People die. People say the truest thing they've ever said in front of a lawyer and 14 witnesses on Thanksgiving. Love, in that family, was a currency with an exchange rate that only ever went one direction. Grandma Ruth understood something I didn't, that you cannot argue with people who have decided what you are. You can only outlast them, and put it in writing, and let paper do what your voice can't. Paper outlasts people. I kept the folding card table. It's not in a closet. It's set up in the bay window of the front room, with 2 chairs, and every Thursday Josefina and I eat lunch at it and she tells me about her son's band. Last week I sat there alone at 4:52 in the afternoon with a cup of coffee, and I turned to look at the whole empty house, all of it, mine, deeded and recorded and paid for. And I said it out loud to nobody. I did it. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the one who carried everything and got nothing for it, share this. Share it with one person. The one who needs to hear that the door eventually opens, even when every hand on the other side is pushing it shut. Subscribe if you want to hear what happened to Diane 6 months later, in the parking lot of a grocery store in Kingsley, because that story is worse. And comment I did it if you've ever walked out of a room you thought you'd never leave. I see you. I see every single one of you. And I'm proud of you.